Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive, the podcast that skips small talk and goes straight for the concepts that shape our thinking and behavior. In this podcast, cold expertise is defenestrated as warm philosophy is enthroned in an attempt to explore the field in which we're all scientists looking for answers, living well. Hello world, welcome to another episode of the Deep Dive with Eyal Shai. I'm joined today by two recurring guests, Brooke Bowman and Reddy. Hi to you both.
Hi.
Hello, hello.
And today I will start with a preamble to explain how it came about that the two of you are here. And the thing is that I've been so busy with living well in the concept. And knowing that there's one thing that I think is universal about living well that people, at least in developed countries, Western countries, think about, and they would exclude the very fringes of society in terms of its people. They would just offhand think that here is some place where you just can't live well, or and this sits at the base of all our fears pretty much, that we work our asses off and we save money. And I implied in that is the assumption that we don't want to be destitute. We don't want to be living on the street. We don't want to be homeless. We always want to have a roof over our head. And you both have had experiences with living there outside of this whole rat race that's going on, and I've had a liminal experience that's not completely comparable, but has elements of it, because let's say I've met a lot of people who came from that world into the world of just Hippie Haven in middle Georgia. That's this remote place. And just knowing you both and knowing that it would be great to do a podcast together, I thought that it would be great if we explored a little bit living on the outside, if I can call it that. I'm not really sure what to call it yet. How do some of the things there happen, what it is like, and then also what lessons could be taken away from living in the place where most people really dread of living in, and just seeing how all of it connects to living well. And yeah, just to kick things off, I'd really love to hear from you both, whoever wants to go first. Were you ever scared of getting to that place yourself, like most people are?
I guess I will go first. I wasn't so much actively scared of it. I just didn't believe that I would end up there. It just did not even enter into possibility in my mind. And then suddenly I was there. Suddenly I was on the street. And that was kind of like one of a number of moments where just something in my brain shattered a little bit, and I had to kind of pick up the pieces. That being said, just on the topic, to follow from your introduction there, I do feel like if I was able to find happiness both on the street and in Los Angeles, like two things separately that people think it's not possible to find happiness in, I have this like deep-seated feeling of just peace. And like, I know that I will be happy no matter what, because I've like found it there. If I can find it there, I can find it anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of not being able to find happiness in a certain environment, and finding happiness is only possible in a certain environment. That whole idea was something that I just couldn't wrap my head around, right? Like growing up, I grew up in a city. So the last thing I ever thought of, and like I had absolutely no idea that this whole concept of a developing nation and a developed nation and a third world nation and a first world nation, I was like, fuck you. What the fuck are you guys even talking about, right? Like I grew up scoffing that idea, because I grew up, in a city. I grew up in a modern city which had pretty much everything the Western world offered. And like, there was no way I thought of myself as, growing up in an underdeveloped country whatsoever, right? And I actually hated that fact. So for me, the idea of living on the streets, the idea of struggling, suffering, poverty, like, try to make ends meet, like that was an adventure, right? Like for me, that was like, why the fuck did I have to be born with all of these things? Like, why am I in a comfortable family? Like, why did I have to win the genetic lottery, right? Like, I wanted to taste the rawness of life. And I found myself constantly being pulled towards that. Like, I don't know why. It happened through drugs. Like, for me, the gateway towards that world was through drugs, right? Like, I would get stoned and I knew that I would land up in that world. Like that was the only way someone like me who grew up in, I won't say I grew up in the lap of luxury, but I definitely grew up far beyond the poverty line. So there was no way that I would struggle to eat food or struggle to, live in a comfortable place. I had food, clothing, electricity. I had all of that. I had a comfortable roof over my head, but yet I craved, living beyond the fringe, right? Like I wanted to live out there. I was like, what's out there? Like, why am I not allowed to go out there? There was this sense that, like growing up, parents are like, oh, you don't go there. Don't speak to so that, don't go out there. Don't speak to those people. Don't do that. It's dangerous. Be safe. Stay here. Don't go beyond that line. So there was always this barrier, this invisible edge that separated us from them. Right. And it wasn't like they were evil, but it was clear that if I went beyond that edge, there was danger there. Right. I didn't know what kind of danger, but there was clear danger on the other side of that line. And that was like exciting. Oh my God, there's fucking danger there. What the fuck am I doing?
Okay.
Get on the other side.
So you remind me an anecdote. So I haven't been in that place myself, but like I said, I've met addicts before in the farm in Georgia I was living in, and one of them was a dear friend. He recounted to me that in high school they had the person who is an addict come to them, recovering addict, and telling the kids in high school, it's like how bad heroin is. It's like, don't ever touch this stuff, it will ruin your life. And that how, since the moment he touched it, all that was on his mind is heroin and how to get it, and the story of an addict. And my friend told me, it's like, this was a light bulb moment for him, because it's like, wow, this stuff must be really good. So it's interesting that I have heard this story about fascination before, but Reddy is like, you go down that path, you go through the gateway, you end up there. Is it not weird? Let's say the first night, the first week out, is it not weird? Is it not more uncomfortable, or is it not scary? And
I don't know. I mean, in a sense, like I didn't actually jump off the deep end. I probably did at some point, but even before that, I had like these, micro experiences, some sort of like, I could call it like a picnic. Like I would just sneak away into the nearest ghetto I could find and just wander around there. But the fact is, at that point, I was always treated like an outsider, right? I was just this lost kid who had wandered into a bad neighborhood without knowing it. So like there would always be some good Samaritan who would like, escort me out of there and say, oh my God, you poor kid, you're lost, and let me find you your way home, right? So I would, even if I would find myself into the, the lion's den, I would be escorted out by the lion saying, oh, no, you're too young to get into this place, get out, let me find you a safe place, right? I'll get you safe passage out of here. And I guess I was just lucky in that, in the early years, this probably started off, this fascination was like around 11, 12. And I kept like, wandering into such places everywhere I could see them and find them. And I would, constantly get pushed away. This is not where you belong. Go back to where you belong. Go back to where you belong. But I think it was finally around like 16 when I managed to finally get out of where, I grew up, and throw myself headlong into this completely new universe, this completely the underbelly of civilization or society as we like to see it. And I don't know, man. I mean, I just like, there was no fear whatsoever. There was this insane electric excitement. I don't know. I mean, was it just wishful thinking? Was it just, just like a kid being naive and just like being crazy about the whole thing? Or was it just because I was stoned as fuck that I didn't feel any fear? I don't know, but there was no fear whatsoever. There was like this insane, I mean, like I've seen people getting killed in front of my eyes. I've seen, it's been crazy. I mean, like all of this stuff is happening in front of me. I'm like, I'm so stoned, like I can barely even react to half the stuff that's happening around me. But it didn't scare me. At no point was I scared. I was enthused. I was amused. I was amazed. I was like, wow. I was just in awe. And I think like it's ridiculously stupid at this point of time to look back and think like, why the fuck were you not afraid? Like, but I really don't know why I wasn't afraid. Maybe I just wasn't concerned about myself, or maybe I was just in that state of a trip where you just think of yourself as an observer and you don't even believe like you're physically, in this space.
Yeah, that's super interesting. How about you, Brooke? What do you remember the beginning? Was there a realization that you had reached the place where you really didn't think about reaching, but I guess it becomes undeniable? And like, what was your inner reaction to it? Was it shock or something else? And were you anxious to get out of there, or could you take us through it a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, if we're talking specifically about my time spent on the street, that there was an element of shock initially that was replaced pretty quickly by apathy. I didn't have the fear element. But I did not have like the seeking danger, excitement element for the most part. There were some aspects that kind of made me feel a little bit like a badass, and I enjoyed that. I think it got me some street cred, if somebody was like waving a gun around or things like that, and I would just be like, all right, what are we doing, guys? I think that helped with some of the dudes I was hanging out with. But for me it was really just I had lost all sight of what I needed to do to be a functioning human in the world, like how I could care enough to. I had lost kind of like all hope, and therefore I was kind of like wandering.
Yeah, and for both of you, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the time when you're living on the street, you're also addicts, right? There is a cyclicality involved around getting the substance, using the substance, and going on, right? So that pretty much, that's the equivalent of going to work, right? And the goal is very clear. Just instead of being a consumer who buys a house later in life or whatever, it's just this very immediate chase after a substance. Is that fair to say?
For me, I stopped opiates right when I got on the street. Mm-hmm. And opiates are the ones that really you kind of like need if you're using daily, you need in order to be well. I did graduate to crystal meth at that time. That's what everyone I knew used. It's very cheap. It's very easily accessible. It also helps keep you warm if you were in the outdoors. And it helps keep you awake because you get hassled by police all the time. Things aren't always like safe places for women to sleep. And it's a little deceptive though, because then you just end up falling asleep randomly in the middle of the sidewalk somewhere else because you've been out for too many days. But it was a little bit like a job. But in that case, like heroin, I wanted to be using up until the week before I quit. I was telling people that I didn't see myself ever stopping. And it's funny how things like that work. But the crystal meth was really just, I didn't really like it. It just helped me forget how bad of a place I was in.
Wow. And you Reddy?
The idea that I didn't think that I was using drugs, right? It just, for me, the idea of doing drugs was like a love affair. It's like, I was like, oh man, like all my life, I was like, I'm just seeking this higher experience that real life or reality was too boring, too mundane, too routine. And drugs had taken me to a world beyond what the world had to offer, right? So I was just like besotted. I was just in love with the experience, with the world. It opened me up to a different world of, whatever it is, whether it was crime, whether it was, the underbelly of society, but I just felt that that world was a lot more real, right? There was so little. It's so funny to think about it now because there's so much, conning and manipulation happening all the time. Everyone's trying to hustle each other, and you're trying to con each other, rip each other off their stash. And like it's a dog eat dog world. And yet at the same time, I was like, fuck, this world is so real. Like, in the real world, or the world I came from, everyone, like there was this undercurrent of people were saying something, people meant something else. And I never felt that I belonged in the world I grew up in the so-called real world, right? Like, so for me, the idea of living on the streets, going through all of that, the struggle, the suffering, the hardships, not knowing where you are, not knowing where you wake up, not knowing whom you're waking up next to, all of this element it just felt like an adventure. Like, I just felt like, holy fuck, like, can this get any crazier? Can this get any more exciting? Can this life get any madder than what it is? So, like,
so in terms of mood and emotion, like what characterizes that time for you? The mood is what, and what emotion is prevalent in that time?
I don't think I've as a child, I think I was probably, so my story is a little crazy in the sense, I think as a child, I had a few seizures and epileptic seizures. And so I was put on heavy psychiatric medication as a little child, as an infant, right? So up to the age of 5, I was on like heavy psychiatric medication for like seizures and stuff like that. So I think I was already an addict by then. Right. So at 5, when I was weaned off and everything was fine, and they're like, okay, cool. You're not going to you're not going to get seizures anymore. You're all good. You're sorted. But by then I was already probably hooked onto those stuff. Right. And like for the rest of my life, as far as I can remember, from 5 onwards, I was always trying to get high somewhere or the other. I would always fake a cough to get some sort of cough syrup, like get some codeine into my system. Like, there was always this urge towards getting high in some way or the other. And I don't know how this relates with the whole thing, but it's just strange. I don't feel like I was a very emotional person. I still don't think I'm a very emotional person, in the sense that I don't get caught up by emotions as much. Like when I look at how other people respond to emotions today, I think, holy fuck. I mean, like, why is this bothering people? Like, okay, you're sad. It's like, it doesn't, like, I don't know. I think, am I cold? Am I like uncaring? Am I unfeeling? Have I done so much shit that, like emotions, I don't feel emotions anymore? I don't know. Like I can feel it, but I don't get swept away by them. I don't get washed away by them. I don't get deluged by, emotion. So I don't know, man. But then, with drugs, it's like that. You're high, you're happy, you want to do drugs. You're sad, you want to do drugs. You're angry, you want to do drugs. Like there's no emotion under which you don't want to do drugs. You know what I mean?
So it sounds like it might not be that different from, like, in terms of, since you seem not to be so much affected by, what's going on around you, and even excited by it. It sounds like, this circumstance is not something that impacted your inner life so much, I guess. Like
that's like a tricky question, right? Like, I don't know, man. Like everything seems like it's very surreal, right? When you're tripping, you don't really know what's real, what's surreal, what's actually happening, what you're tripping on, whether it's you imagining shit or whether that stuff is actually happening. I don't know. I mean, like this, you're in this constant haze. At least I was like in that haze most of the time. I didn't know if what I was thinking about the other person or what I was reading from the other person was my own paranoia, or whether it was actually what the other person was doing to me. It's a crazy world. It's like this world where you don't know whether your inner reality is in sync with the outer reality of what the world says is reality, right? So it's very hard to say.
Gotcha.
What I was feeling was what was really happening.
I'm really interested in thinking about how we could connect that to living well and start exploring the area of whether living well is at all possible on some level. And I should say that to me, living well is enjoying mental health. And we usually see addiction as such a negative thing because it is, coming from the root of the world is just basically being a slave to a master. And could you be mentally healthy while you're a slave to a master? So Reddy, you mentioned that you didn't exactly feel like a slave, yet on some level, you do recognize that you were controlled by impulses that did not originate with your authentic self, maybe? Is that fair to say? And would you say that you saw yourself as being mentally healthy at the time, or is it again falling into the category of just not thinking about doing my thing without much self-awareness even?
In a way, I do feel like I was aware of the aspect that I was addicted. Like, I don't feel like I was ignorant. I was one of those kids who I loved reading up everything about what I was doing, right? If I was doing ketamine, I would read up about it. Like, I wouldn't read up before doing the drugs, but I would do stuff. I would like always dive in headlong. But then I would be like, oh, I want to know more about this. Like, what does this chemical do to me? What does this do to me? How long does it last? Like, what are the effects? What are the side effects? Like, I would love to know everything about it. So in a way, there was a sense of awareness that I was fucking my body up, that I was fucking my mind up in so many different ways, because I would read the side effects, I would read what it does to me. And yet I would do it because I was like, oh, fuck that. I don't even know if I'm going to live that long to face all those side effects. And even if I do, I don't care. It's all worth the trip. So I always did do that. And I won't call that living well, though. I was happy. I was always happy doing drugs. I was always happy living on the streets. I felt like that was a happier world. People were more real, more connected, more loving even, right? More willing to share, despite the fact that, like everyone's trying to steal from each other. And yet there was always this element that I would see the good in people, like the evil in people, was so obvious, was so rampant. And yet the good in people was so genuine. Like you could see the warmth, you could see that love, and it was there, right? It was always there. It would be hiding behind this veneer of dirt and muck, and people didn't want to show their goodness, because on the streets, showing your goodness is weakness, right? Like it means you're likely to be taken for a ride. It means you're easy to con, you're easy to manipulate. So nobody wants to give off that vibe that they're nice and they're loving and they're kind, because that means you're just setting yourself up to get taken advantage of. So but people genuinely were nice, and people genuinely are loving and sharing, which is a lot more than I see in in life as we know it on the surface, right? Where people have homes and jobs and go about their routine lives. So I don't know. I mean, like, how can you say that people up here with access to education and resources are living well when they're not? Because they're living in abundance, right? A person's true nature only comes to the surface when you are lacking, when the odds are against you, when you don't have it. Like it's something like, when you have resources and you don't share it, then, like you don't have the need to share it because everyone around you has those resources. When you are in a situation where you don't have resources, the person next to you doesn't have resources, and how do you share? When you both have hardly anything to share, how do you share? And do you even share? Or do you, steal from the other person? A lot of this is the rawness of being on the streets shows you what living well really is about, right? Like whether you can do it or not is an entirely different thing, but you can see that this is the reality of people, right? It's easy to be nice and generous and loving and charitable because you have shit, right? You have things and then you can share, you can give people. But when you don't, right? I don't know. I always find that on the streets, there's a lot more reality in the way people face it, because you're facing these situations where there's a lack of everything, there's a dearth of everything, there's a scarcity of so many things. Your true nature comes out to the core. I mean, like, I've always been a person who's very comfortable with who I am as a person. And I've done like fucked up shit on the streets, man. I've really fucked people up. I've done all sorts of shit. I've stolen, robbed, manipulated, conned, like short of killing someone. I've pretty much done everything. And not because I didn't try, just because I didn't succeed. And, so there's a world where, and that same shit has been done back to me. So it's, in a way, I have experienced what would normally just be a thought exercise in a philosophy class about living well. I've actually lived that fucking life. So are you telling me that a person who has sat in a philosophy classroom and discussed what would possibly happen as a thought exercise, what would happen if you didn't have this and someone did this, what would you do if someone held you at gunpoint and asked you to shoot your own kid or die? You have all these thought exercises and things like that, but what if you're actually in that situation? So you really know what living well is. You really know whether you're the kind of person who would actually do what you claim to want to do. A lot of people up here on the surface say, hey, I'm a good person. This is what I would do. I would never do something like that. I would never be evil. I would never do shit like that. You don't know, man. You don't know because you've never been in that situation. You don't have a gun to your head. You don't have those dire circumstances in which you actually have to make those decisions. That's when you know really what kind of person you are. It's easy to say, these are my values, this is the system I believe in, this is a religion, or this is a code of life I live by. It's easy to say that when the odds are in your favor, or at least the odds are not against you, right? But on the streets, the odds are usually always against you. So you may not, it may not be easy to live well, but you clearly know what living well is. You clearly know when you're going against what is loving, what is compassionate. You know it. I mean, like I felt it. Like I knew I was doing evil shit. I knew I was fucking people up. I knew I was harming people. I knew each time I introduced someone new to drugs, I was sending them down a fucking path of no return. Right. And practically 90% of the people I lived with, I used with, are fucking dead right now. So it's not something, I'm really proud of. It's not something that I want to live with and say that, hey, so, but that was my reality. And that got me face to face with who I really am as a person.
Yeah. Brooke, do you feel that about maybe we're going to move towards the direction of already coming out of that phase and thinking about what are some of the lessons that can be taken about living well from life on the streets. But for you mentioned that no, you did not feel well or doing well, but were there glimpses in real time of behaviors that you did appreciate, that you got to come across? Maybe a little bit in the vein of what Reddy mentioned, that wouldn't have happened in other circumstances, because whatever you do, maybe it's the need for substance that does make you go out and interact with people, whereas maybe in the so-called normal world, you could be pretty much isolated and not need something from anyone. Almost were there behaviors that got you pondering about the nature of well-being and doing well in life?
So I didn't just need other people for drugs. I didn't know how to feed myself. I didn't know how to clothe myself. I didn't know the first things about how to stay alive on the street. And so there were a lot of like unfortunate power dynamics that happen when you are a girl who needs help on the street. I don't remember exactly where I was going with that, but that's just like a little point. It's a named substance, but it was far more than just that. As far as like living well goes, and I'm not entirely clear. I have had this conversation with you before, or had a conversation with you on your podcast before, but I'm actually not really clear if when you say living well, do you mean living well in a value sense or living well in like a I am thriving kind of sense? Because I think those are two distinct things.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. There hasn't been an episode titled "Living Well," and it's kind of intentional. Like, I don't actually want to didactically saying, but for me, no, I will say it now. For me, living well means being mentally healthy. It's actually a way to describe somebody who's over time is mentally healthy, in the sense that whatever is going on in consciousness is harmonious. Actions are beneficial unto oneself and unto others, because the realization has to be is that I want other people to be doing well around me. It only reciprocates and it only magnifies my own doing well. It's just easier to do. And I'm not in conflict with myself. So I'm not doing this compulsive behavior and then giving myself shit about it, or I'm not having these two minds in one person about things, right? The shoulds versus the wants, right? So this is what living well is to me. It's just not feeling any sort of inner strife or conflict as you move along, not putting yourself down with thoughts, or not having a very strong voice coming from parents and educators or society at large, like you should do that, but always wanting to have a moment to yourself so that you could do this totally be a deviant, right? And do the exact opposite. So that's not living well if you have to fight yourself all the time. So in a sense, it's much closer to the thriving part, right? Because if you put up a facade, living well in the superficial sense, that's like having all the nice stuff, right? And saying the right things. That's virtue signaling. And living well in effect is actually being virtuous. So if that clarifies it all, yeah, I'd like to hear from you if there was any sense of at some point things that have made you realize that maybe you can steer this ship somewhere else and have internal harmony even while you're in that situation.
So it's kind of interesting because I had a fairly different experience on the street, it sounded like, than Reddy did. I never felt like I belonged there. I never felt like this is my home, these are my people. I was an interlude. I was not, I was a tourist. And I spent a lot of time talking to people there. I know you asked earlier about introspection and self-awareness and things like that at the time. And I did spend a lot of time thinking about it. I didn't get to a point where I figured out any answers until after I had already figured out answers, if that makes sense. But I would ask people all the time on the street, like, why are you here? How did you get here? And are you planning on leaving? And so many people were just like, yeah, I love it here. I don't want a real job. Da, 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 da. And I did not believe any of them.
So you would have met Reddy and told him that he's bullshitting.
I didn't meet Reddy, so we can't answer that question.
Yes.
I'm talking about people, like specific people that I knew on an individual level, who would go from talking about how they really wanted to be on the street, and then talking about how awful everything was and how unhappy they were and how these different problems about everything. There was one guy that I didn't really talk to. I remember seeing him. He lived outside of Starbucks. He just had the neatest little tent space. It looked like very like Zen. And he would go sit like cross-legged inside the Starbucks and like work on his laptop every day. And he didn't really talk to anybody. That guy I would have believed was like living well. But for me, there was like a distinct moment. And there were a lot of things that went into that. But I part of it was that that's what I was trying to say earlier. Part of it was that I dropped this victim mentality that I'd had before. Growing up, I felt like I didn't deserve to be unhappy. You know, my parents were together. We had food on the table. We had all of that. And I was still really unhappy. And I was just like, there are kids starving everywhere. There are kids that are dying in wars and things. And I have no right to be unhappy. And that just made me more unhappy. And it wasn't until I got on the street that I had these things happen where I was like, all right, like I can suffer now. I have earned it. These are like objectively terrible things that have happened to me. And I just became this super depressing person to be around. And I had this idea that like, all right, I'm a victim now. Like I made it. And then I wasn't any happier. I was like, it did not help at all. I was just, I remember talking to this girl. I was just like, yeah, you're just like really depressing. I did hang out with us. That's not the kind of person I want to be. And I realized, like, on a fundamental level, like, I hadn't changed. The kind of person I wanted to be hadn't really changed. These things had happened, but they weren't really, like, they didn't really make me feel any worse. And the stuff that had happened when I was a kid that I didn't value on the same kind of level because it wasn't, like, objectively bad. And once I kind of, like, let go, I think that was a big component and a big part of things. I kind of let go of this mentality that I have been wronged. And I just let go of a lot of this like weird shame I had around who I was. I mean, it's kind of like hard to describe without going into a bunch of detail, but there was just a very specific moment after which, you know, I had an accident that attacked me. And that was before then. I had not been using for a few months. I got jobs and everything and really turned things around. I was like happy and chipper and figuring all these things out. And then that incident happened. And then after that, I started using again, but it was totally different from any other time I had used in my life. It didn't feel like a life sentence. It didn't feel like, I don't know, like I just might be doing this forever. I'm like, no, I just got traumatized. I'm going to use this because I need it as like a coping mechanism right now because I don't really have a social support network. And as soon as I'm done with it, I'm going to drop it. And I did. And it was during that period where I felt, fundamentally okay in a way that I had never in my life before. And the difference between before that point and after that point are about as polar opposites as you can get.
It's striking to me. It's striking to me because it relates to my story. And I think the turnaround for me for fighting depression coming out of one, it might not be the street, but coming out of one very serious, dire episode of my life into something that's much brighter, and to seeing a brighter future is definitely the moment where you find your agency, right? When it's not stuff that's happening to you. You're not a victim. And it also recognizing that there's something a little absurd about how we operate and about how things enter our consciousness from who knows what exactly and where exactly do they go, and realizing that we actually have, I think, more power than we realize to summon a certain kind of thought, which eventually, whatever is in our consciousness, this is what we're going to feel inside. And it also informs our actions on the outside. And suddenly you feel empowered to be an active player rather than a victim of some accident. So is that something that you've experienced when you say there was a change between being a victim to being an agent?
Absolutely. And the ramifications of that have kind of like rippled out through many different areas of my life. I use the example, I lived in LA for about a decade. That's where I was on the street. But even before then, I was only on the street for a couple of years. And before then, I was one of those people who was just like, it's hard to make friends in LA. That's just the truth. And now thinking back, I'm like, I didn't host meetups. I didn't like talk to strangers. I didn't do any of the things that one should do if one wants to make friends. And I feel like that's a pretty good example of just kind of like how I didn't have agency in my life, even long before I was on the street. Now I'm like, there is a thing I want. All right, what can I do to get it? And if I see other people talking about a thing they want, I'm like, how can I help you do that? Or like, what do you need? What do you need? Let's work together. Let's make this thing happen, because it just no longer makes sense to me to talk about wanting a thing and then not. And then that, period. Like, okay, how do we make it happen?
And that was a direct result of actually being a victim of something, where in a situation where you kind of unwillingly put yourself in, but you let yourself get to a situation where you were victimized. Did that put like an exclamation mark on the whole thing, and something clicked?
This is something that I don't say very often, because I have butted heads a little bit with some people over this, particularly people in like the trauma queer kind of community. What I did with, maybe if I had something stolen from me, or I was assaulted, or all these, various bad things that would happen, I would sit and think about them, and I would trace the steps back and find various points along the chain of events where I could have changed the outcome and didn't. Like with my piece of ex, like there were so many red flags, and it's not like I didn't see them. I was like, oh, well, that's a weird thing. Let me just keep dating you. and like, oh, this person seems dangerous. Let me just fall asleep where they have access to my stuff. Or let me fall asleep where my stuff is like way over there and I can't watch it. Or let me stay up for 4 days so that I don't have control over when I fall asleep and might end up around really bad people. When I do these kind of exercises, the point of it is not to reduce the responsibility of other people who do bad things. It's because I have no control really over what people do. I have control over what I do. And if I can figure out how to keep myself safer and smarter and more competent every step along the way, I can do that. And I think I was limiting myself by just focusing on the harm other people had done to me, as opposed to like, all right, how can I make sure this doesn't happen again? And it makes it a lot more fun and a lot more exciting way to live, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Reddy, what do you have to add?
Man, I love that experience of extreme agency. Like, that's pretty much how I live my life. I love feeling like, even when shit goes down and like things go wrong and like everything is not the way I'd want it to be, I feel that sense of like, okay, I let this happen, right? Like I made the choices that led to me being in this situation. And I feel like that makes me feel like I'm still in control, right? Because on the streets, like there's so much that's not in control. There's practically everything around you is out of your control, right? Because if you look at it, what is a person really in control of? Shelter, food, clothing, and those basic survival necessities, right? Like, and the moment like a person lives in society, he has all of these catered to and protected and preserved, right? This is my house, no one else comes in. This is my space, nobody else comes in. These are my clothes, nobody else wears them, right? This is my food, nobody else is going to eat it. Like those are certainties that's expected. But now out on the streets, like each one of those things can be taken away. My own personal dignity can be taken away. My own life can be taken away. My food can be taken away. My stash can be taken away. Everything, the space I'm sleeping in can be taken away. Everything is up for grabs, right? And in a world like that, like the last thing I want to do is start feeling like I'm not in control because shit's going, shit's out of my hands. Like, so I don't know, it was just like a necessity for me to feel like I was in control, even if I wasn't. I wanted to tell myself, okay, oh, fuck, I lost that. Oh, fuck, I didn't find this. So someone stole that from me. Someone took this away from me. Like, how did I land up here? Who brought me here? Who took me away from where I was? Like, there's all of these questions I wake up with, and I was like, oh, fuck that. I must have fucked something up, right? And most of the time, I didn't even know what it was, but I would always put this out there that it was, even if I wasn't to blame, it was my responsibility, right? Like, that's the way I like to frame it in my head. Even today, I'm like, okay, when things don't go the way I wanted to, maybe I'm not to blame, but at the end of the day, the responsibility is still mine, right? By looking at life that way, it just makes everything things don't feel as helpless as, as one would feel in that situation, right? And so I love that experience of taking extreme agency for everything that's happening in my life. And, it's like, in a way, that is one of the traits of living well, right? Like, because if I'm constantly looking for someone else to blame, whether it's circumstances, whether it's, because that's what happens most of the time, right? Like, people complaining about living on the streets, this people complain about living in society as well. Like you complain about your representative, you complain about the political system, you complain about, who's in charge of the world, you complain. There's always 100 things to complain. You go to any office, the best of offices, and at the water cooler, everyone's complaining. Misery loves company. People love sharing complaints, right? Like that's one of the ways people get to bond with each other. So I don't really think people who are out on the streets aren't living well. Maybe one aspect of people who are out on the streets, like me as an addict, weren't living entirely well, because there's the physical element of fucking myself up every single day, right, every single time I'm doing stuff, right?
Yeah.
And mentally as well. Like it's not like all trips are good trips. There are bad trips, there are bad times, things go wrong, things don't go well, you're all fucked up, you lost your head, you don't even know where you are. There's a whole bunch of shit going wrong. But at the same time, things that could happen anywhere, right? That could happen when you have things in your favor as well. And that there are other kinds of people who stay on the streets. There are people who are just poor. There are people who are criminals.
Right. So yeah. I'd love to do.
Everyone is losing that aspect of, is losing that physical and mental health all the time.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thought experiment. I will say, and then move on to the thought experiment. I just would love us to kind of think about it. But I would like to say that, definitely the feeling. First of all, I'm happy that you're taking it in a positive way. I think that a lot of people could somehow feel that they have agency, but they use it all the time to like protect themselves against things happening. And that can create kind of compulsive behaviors. Of like OCD, everything is not safe. I must make sure that I'm safe, must make sure that I'm safe, must make sure that I'm safe. But the framework of seeing well-being, which is not really developed, because I think most people don't actually take the time to really develop a concept of living well in their mind, which is a shame, which is what I'd like to rectify if I can at all. And most people just assume that living well is just some sort of a passive thing that happens when problems stop springing up. When in effect problems are always springing up. You're never going to get run out of problems, right? Impossible. And when you realize that, and you realize that you should always be proactive about things, you should be the one, and living well is the process. It's not some result of your actions, it's the process itself. And it's not something that you need to defend from things happening, but something that you need to cultivate. And that's when you go on the offense, so to speak. You become active. You don't just keep complaining, like you say, and fearing that things are going to happen to you. But to get to the thought experiment, or just questions like, what do you both think about? Could there be a person? Because there is a story about a guy named Diogenes in Athens, in ancient Greece, who just went and lived in a barrel, and supposedly was happy. And he, in fact, is the first cynic, right? So cynic is from kuon, dog. He lived like a dog. And said that it was happy. So is that in the experience of both of you? Let's say we leave out the aspect of being an addict, which might very well challenge anyone to be enjoying well-being. But life among with these hardships that the street kind of puts around you, that is totally. That is not completely ruling out living well to you on its own.
I hesitate to make comments on anyone else's internal state. I do draw inferences. I make some assumptions, but they are not definitive ones. One thing that I use to kind of like shape my perception of how well, or like how honest somebody's being if they say they're happy is how consistent they are, and how much they're like, if you hang out with them over time, is their mood kind of like reflecting what they say it is, or what I feel like it should be reflecting given their words? Are they acting in a way that's in alignment with their words? Are they having like sudden mood shifts that I can't trace the cause of? That kind of thing. I think those are all maybe kind of flags that somebody isn't being honest either with themselves or with me. That being said, I don't really feel qualified to like make definitive statements about what other people feel. For myself, I've been kind of experimenting with this idea that like having really high amounts of energy is correlated with how, and I use the word thriving, but I think we're kind of pointing at the same thing versus living well versus thriving. Because at least for me, when I started living in alignment with myself and figured out, like suddenly realized, and this is only after I had dealt with it, but that I had like crippling anxiety, and how, I'd already come up with kind of practices just sort of like unintentionally to manage that. But I feel like so much energy over the course of my life was being expended in these like inner conflicts, in my actions not aligning with my values, and just anxiety and fears and all of this stuff going on in my head. And then once those kind of went away, just like I just have like almost endless energy to do things. But then also, as I said before, I had that point after which the switch flipped. I never described myself as a happy person ever in my life until that moment when I was like, oh, this is a new state of being. I have never felt this way before. And I kind of knew that it was like a fundamental thing, that this change, I just had this idea, this gut feeling that it was going to be a permanent one. And I also made a bunch of predictions at the time, first to myself and then to my parents when I got back in contact with them. And they were kind of like, okay, Brooke, we're glad you're not using meth anymore. But kind of one by one, those predictions have been borne out over time. I knew they would be. I knew it needed time to kind of prove that I wasn't just talk. But so I kind of like entered the state of feeling like I was thriving on the streets and had to start from where I was. Where I was recently very traumatized, using crystal meth, like homeless. And over time, I mean, we referenced this kind of like, I talked about this in the Scaling Up episode that I did with you before. So that was what my starting point was. But I feel like I have been consistently and fairly rapidly, like, just becoming better and better and better and more the person that I want to be. And I'm already the person I want to be, and I'm just going to become more the person I want to be and do more of the things I want to do. So I definitely feel like I was on the street for some time after that switch flipped, and I was okay with it because I knew it wasn't permanent. I knew that I had figured my shit out and that I would get off, and then I did. Yeah,
beautiful, because that's exactly that. I feel like this really drives home the point that it is about the process. It's not about creating this future for yourself that when you reach, you're going to be well. This is about, and that moment is infinitely fascinating to me, right? What happens when the switch goes off and you are now not thinking about the way to somewhere, but focusing on the process. Now, how were you aiming at the predictions you made? Were you keeping them in mind? And would you share one or two, like these milestones? You don't have to.
No. I'm deciding which ones would be most fruitful to share. One I already said was that this was just an internal one. I didn't tell anybody else, or maybe I did at the time, but I'm not in context anymore. That was that I was using crystal meth again after that break. And then my ex, that incident, I was like, all right, I am just using until I don't need to anymore. This is a temporary thing. And I will drop it when I feel ready, like strong enough to handle, processing this trauma, whatever. And I did. When I got off the street with my parents, I was saying like, all right, but like you're very like, manic right now because you just got off the street and you're really, excited to be safe and all these things, and you're going to plateau and it's going to go back down. And I never hit that point. I even had like pretty severe health problems. And, there were a few weeks where I just kind of hung out in bed and watched Netflix because I was really unwell physically, but it never, like, I never reached the same, like, I never felt like, okay, suddenly I'm not happy anymore. Like, it's not like I'm, got this temporary thing again. I also told these are kind of like a little bit different. But I mean, I told my mom that I was going to make my job out of Twitter when I first joined. And I, on my way to doing that, I was one of the few people who were just like, yeah, Vibe Camp is going to work. And I don't know, I just feel a lot more confident in my competency now. And I'm it's growing much like, to trust my instincts and my intuitions a lot more.
That's amazing. Yeah. And yeah, that really gets me to a point that I wanted to make it a stop in our discussion, or a station to stop by. Reddy, what do you feel? Did life on the street like inoculate you going forward against some other, future? I always have this conception. I want to know if it's a conception or a misconception that you do get, hardened in a sense, but more robust in the face of danger because you've lived that life, right? Is it something, am I just romanticizing, or is it really that, you've seen some shit and now you're less afraid of whatever you may face in the future? Is that fair to say that this is something that positive that could be taken from knowing that you have gone through this?
Were you asking? Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I thought you were asking Reddy. That's what I was asking. I thought I heard Reddy's name in there. So go ahead.
Either of you is good.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, I do feel that, right? Because this is something I've spoken about before. I remember the discussion about, people living in the favelas in Brazil, right? Like the idea of people living below the poverty line, not being happy, is this conception that much of the world has, much of the, the so-called above the surface world has, right? That people below the poverty line, people living on the streets, people living in slums, people living unhappy, right? They may be poor, but assuming that poor equals unhappy is a very strange assumption, right? Is an assumption based on a lot of hubris that just because I have plenty means I'm happy, right? And that's something that I've seen on the streets, that people who didn't have anything could be happy, people who had less than other people could be happy, and people up on the surface with a lot of stuff were a lot unhappier, right? And this, one of the things that I realized at my rock bottom was the fact that when I hit my rock bottom, it wasn't the fact that I was physically, completely scrounged out or was like, mentally a wreck. It was that I was spiritually disconnected from anyone and everyone, right? I was so paranoid that every single person around me was after my stash. So anyone and everyone, whether it was a known person or an unknown person, whether it was a person from the streets or a person above the streets, every single person, I was afraid. I was afraid they were after me. So there was this constant fear of people. There was this constant, belief that everyone was out to take something that I had, right? And I practically had nothing.
And what is the stash, Reddy? What is the stash?
Oh, the drugs, man, the drugs, like the stuff that
yeah, but how
right?
do you keep them so that it's everyone's got their hiding place somewhere, like under a rock or something?
Well, I mean, yeah, it depends on where you want to hide your stash, right? But like, you always have something on your person. You have something for a rainy day, which doesn't last more than, probably a couple of hours before you find it. And either you find it and do it, or someone else does it. But the idea of you're always holding on to something. You have like a bunch of hiding places. You probably have like 5-6 places on your person because you don't want to keep everything in one place. There's a whole, like, you figure out shit. Like, you figure out like, okay, this is my space. This is where I'm going to do stuff. This is a space where I'm going to take someone if I want to do stuff with them, right? There's always these little alleys, and you have these little, it's almost like at some point of thing, I think I was just living out childhood fantasies of having like a treasure map where I'd keep stuff around, except that I'd fucking forget what the treasure map was. So I didn't even remember where half the stuff was. So, all of these things happen. And then the fact is that like all of this happening wasn't really what my rock bottom was all about. It was the fact that I couldn't connect with anyone. There was nobody I could relate with, not a friend, not an enemy, not family, not associates, not even using buddies, like everyone. I was just like this lone creature in the universe, right? That feeling to me was the worst thing ever, right? And now if you think of the idea that living well, like living with whom, living is something, is relational, right? Like even convicts on living in solitary confinement, like make friends with that little rat. Like almost every movie you see, like there's a hardened criminal sitting there in solitary, and then he's friends with a tiny little rat or with a cockroach. Like humans want to connect, humans need to connect, right? This desire and need to relate and to connect in some form or the other, like that was what I'd lost. And physically, I'd become this ET kind of creature who was like, physically so scary that people on the street would just cross the road if they saw me. Like I looked like an alien, right? Like, so the idea that, oh my God, you don't want... So there was this idea, there was this reality that I didn't want to connect with anyone. Nobody wanted to connect with me. And that loneliness for me was the worst thing ever, right? Other than that, if you ask me today and you'd asked me then, I would have said I'm fucking living the life. Why? Because my idea of living well is the same as what it was then. It's if I can think, speak, and act on, as I feel. If I think something, then I say that shit and I act on that. That harmony, to me, is my idea of living well, whether it was then or whether it's today. Right? If I wanted to say something to someone back in the day, I would have said it, not just because I was doing the drugs, which gave me the courage to go out and say shit to people. I do the same shit today. If I don't like someone, I go up and say that straight to their face. Right? If I don't think something should not be done, if I think something should not be done, I'll go there and just say it and I'll follow it up. I'll do what needs to be done. That harmony of thinking, speaking, and doing the same thing is to me my idea of living well. Okay, like the rest of it, yes, mental health, physical health, social well-being, connected relationships, good relationships, all of that stuff, good financial standing, some modicum of respect in society, all of those things, constitute the holistic idea of living well. But at the individual level, to me, it's just that, right? If I think something, I should have, the courage to say what I think, and the gumption to act on that, right? And if I can do that now, that's awesome, right? Because back then, I could have probably said what I thought, but I couldn't do anything on that because I was just this, creature who couldn't act on anything. Like I didn't have like I had the conviction up here, but like nothing beyond that. Like I had no way of acting on those convictions. Right. And that was like the worst thing ever. Right. Because I'm a man of strong convictions. And if I have something that I believe in, I would love to act upon that because that to me is important. Like if I believe in something, I got to act on that shit. I couldn't do that. Right. I couldn't do that. I was like so insignificant back then.
Yeah. I just want to, can I just say really quick on the question of like, are those kind of situations, do they change how scared I am now? And like my answer is absolutely yes. Like that's I feel like it's weird to say this, but my street experiences and like the trauma I went through and everything, like it's a vast form of privilege. And I think a lot of people like kind of underestimate that or just aren't, it doesn't even occur to them to think that way. But I can organize like a 400 person festival and having never gone to Burning Man and have it work because like, or like even just take a risk on it because like, there's no one here threatening my physical safety. Like it's so like my whole risk calculation, like everything is just different now because I don't know. I look at especially the rationality community. I adore my rationality friends, rationalist friends. But some of them are just not very rational when it comes to anxiety and things like that. I like to use like the risk of death it's kind of like my meter. Like, some people will drive really, really erratically, and it's just like that has a real risk of death. Like there is actually, but they won't ask a girl out or go talk to her. Like, what is the worst thing that's going to happen if you go talk to a girl right now? And it's just like, it's just not rational.
Yeah. I connect with that so much. First of all, yes. And, for me as well, like I remember quite vividly that the time in my life, which after, like 8-9 years of being pretty depressed, I just realized it's like, at age 10, getting up in the morning and finding out that my mom was killed during the night is, that's by far the worst thing that's going to happen to me. Like, yeah, I could imagine, I can still imagine, and I often do because it's hardwired into me, but I'm still having like horrible thoughts about what would happen to people that are dear to me. And that I can imagine, I guess, a lower point happening. But generally speaking, realizing that, I had gone through probably the worst shit in my life, like I'm done with it at 10. That's exactly as you say. That's almost like immediately that's suddenly a privilege, right? Like I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to. I had gone through it. I came not unscathed, but I have proven to myself that despite going through such a tough thing, I am able to flourish now. I'm able to live well or enjoy well-being. Well, then I am decidedly less scared of what the future holds, and that helped me come up with this whole kind of personal mythology thing where I am a phoenix that was reduced to ashes at one point and has risen. And, if the need be, that will happen again. If I am put out again and become ashes again, well, I will rise again. And I do think that is a big takeaway. And, in general, I had my suspicion, which I didn't open up with, but I had my own hypothesis coming into this conversation with the both of you that we might understand that the circumstances are not easy. Living on the street or going through trauma or anything like that, that's not easy, but still, it's not the end of the story. It does not mean that living well, living in it with internal harmony is totally out of the question. Yes, of course, as you both mentioned, some people get on the street for various reasons. It could be serious mental illness, which is a mental illness in itself. It's not the street that gives it to people. If they can't keep up any sort of a coherent reality or whatever. It could be addiction that probably is going to cause is going to be a big obstacle on the way to well-being because it's marked by internal struggle. But it could also be that a sane person could choose to live a life, and it doesn't have to be in the gutter, in the worst place, in a barrel like Diogenes, but could live somewhere poor and still be well. And I think that's important to make that point. And now I'm thinking, it's like, should we send teenagers for a year on the street so that they go through this?
Why not? Like if there's always like the quotes of both these guys, Freud and Jung, come to mind, right? Like Freud says, one day in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful, right? And like I have no regrets. Like the worst of shit that's happened to me, the worst of shit that I've done to others, like I honestly have no regrets. Like I have listed those things down. I've tried to make amends where possible. And, but yet I realized that is what has helped me understand the most about myself, right? That pain, that struggle that I went through, is not suffering unless I think it is, right? On the other hand, it's like lessons that I've gleaned from that dirt, right? It's incredible. And again, Jung's quote says something about like a tree that reaches up to the heavens has to have its roots reaching down to hell, right? So it's almost like I don't know, we're the fucking gifted ones, man. We're the ones who got this gift of this pain, this struggle, this trauma, right? That to go through all of those experiences. And that's what makes me like, I am a happy person. I am a bubbly, vivacious person, not because things are going great for me right now, but because things have gone bad for me in the past, right? And every time things go wrong in the present, like Brooke said, I mean, it's just like, what's the worst that could happen? I mean, I didn't die, right? And on the streets, that's how it is. Like, if you're just like, if I'm sitting and cribbing about, oh, my best friend just tried to fucking kill me. How the fuck could he do that? Like, why would this shit happen to me? Like, oh my God, like, that's trauma in the past. If it was 2 seconds ago, like, wake the fuck up, because another guy could be coming for you the very next second, right? So there's also that sense that going through that kind of a wild, dangerous experience teaches you that shit can go wrong, but that's not all that can happen. Like, things can go wrong again. Like, I can't spend my time dwelling on the fact that shit went wrong, because I mean, I look at it now as a joke. Oh, wait, look, shit can go wrong again the very next second. So don't spend your time looking back because there's someone up in front gunning for you again, right? But it doesn't have to be someone gunning for you. It could also be someone standing ahead of me, handing out a helping hand, reaching out with affection, like you. Like, you're one of those few people who's, like I said, I have fucking more enemies than friends, man. But like, I'm making a lot of friends now. I'm making friends today. I'm connecting honestly, deeply. People like you who are genuinely nice. And that's something that probably might be more difficult for me, coming from the streets or coming from a difficult life, or coming from an addict, living the addict's life, is that learning to trust that people can love you just out of affection, just out of love, not necessarily because there's an ulterior motive, or not necessarily because they want to get something out of you, because that's how I would see things. I would be like, if someone's being nice to me, I'm like, what the fuck do you want, motherfucker? Like, there's that's like the first thing that comes to mind. Like, why the fuck are you being nice to me? Right? So for me today, when I see someone and they're nice to me, I'm like, I can drop my guard down and say, hey, it's really nice to know that you're being nice to me. Like, how can I be nice to you back? Right? So probably that's like the opposite of what most people above the surface would think. Like, people on the surface would assume the best out of people. I tend to assume the worst out of people. And now I've reached like a compromise with myself. I say, I'm going to assume the worst out of a situation and the best out of people. So that's where I'm at now.
Yeah, I'm not sure that people on the surface, as you said, like really think very highly of other people. I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not sure, but it could be. Yeah, Brooke, what do you think?
About which aspect of what was just talked about? I feel like
just generally, like what are some takeaways? Is there a way to maybe get people closer to that? We don't want to throw people in the street where they're unsafe probably and lose their life because it's the harshest of environments. But could we do something and make sure that people understand that living well is in fact or does not in fact depend on having so much material abundance? Like, of course, it's a bonus to live in material abundance, impossible, and with people, because it is easier to just get by and so on. But could we do something to challenge people a little bit so that they would understand that living well is possible away from riches, let's say?
So that's one of the reasons why I call it a privilege, because I would have skated. I'm fairly confident that I would have spent my entire life, had events not led to me kind of like crashing and burning and ending up on the street in like kind of like cataclysmic way. I would have just spent my entire life being fine and just having no idea that it was possible to be many, many, many times better than fine. The way that I feel consistently now for the last several years is more than worth the price that I paid to get here. And I felt that on a deep level immediately. It is really, really difficult to describe the difference in my mentality and like mental landscape. That being said, like I feel like, I feel like resources are a handicap in this, that when you are not put into these kind of circumstances, it's much, much harder to learn the kind of lessons that I did to get here. But I don't think that it's impossible. And that's kind of one of the things that I'm really driven to work on. Once I get a little bit more stability in my life, I plan to try to write a book. I also started writing a bunch. I had a blog when I, maybe like 6 months or so after I got off the street, I was like, all right, I'm going to try to help make the world a happier place. As opposed to when I was in college, I had all these ideas about the way our brains worked and how to like live well. But in that context, I thought of it as like how to avoid suffering. And I think that was one of the key transformations when I was on the street. I don't think it's enough to avoid suffering. I think that you must actively seek the things that are good. So I was writing in this blog and it wasn't really having the kind of impact that I was like expecting it to. So that is part of why, and I think I discussed this in the last episode that I did with you, part of why I'm doing things now, as opposed to talking about things quite as much. I think there is a definite need to talk about things, to write about things, to supplement doing things, but that the more that I can live well publicly and kind of like use that, like provide that as an example for people. I feel like it may not happen very quickly and it may not happen on large scales, but I do believe that I am having an impact on individual lives who may go on to have impacts on individual lives around them. And like, that's how revolutions start.
Yeah. I'm so happy to hear that. And again, this doing versus talking or just thinking thing resurfaces again and again. And I just, talking about consistency, I think it definitely shows you're getting it. I definitely think, I don't know if we'll be throwing out teenagers on the street so they learn their life lessons and like give them this privilege anytime soon. But I do think it's so important, like for me, and this kind of closes the circle for me. I went to this liminal space of a homestead in the middle of the forest, and I was meeting people coming there with mental challenges like schizophrenia, with addictions, and just people who couldn't find their place and have gone through some similar shit that you're describing. And this helped me in a more vicarious way, of course, understand that there are things like that it's not the end of the story, that it's not this thing that to be dreaded in the worst way, and that there is an ability to rise from there and change and still live well. And I think if not taking people to the street and just releasing them, then at least don't do it on via negativa of kind of showing them how terrible it is to be an addict and because they might have the idea that my friend had. Just like, wow, this shit's pretty powerful. Instead, just maybe try to facilitate meeting people from all walks of life, rather than demonize people who live on the street, demonize addicts, demonize mentally ill people. And instead try to integrate, because people will have a world to, people could really benefit from just meeting people from all walks of life and realizing the lessons that you and Reddy have learned by associating with people who have had these experiences. And that is, I feel like, what I wanted to achieve with this podcast. Really is to encourage people to go out there, and I don't mean the street, but to go out there and meet people and not necessarily go on the street, but not necessarily live on there and experience all the hardship, but do engage with people, do learn from every person. Don't just learn from the CEO who's become, a millionaire by 25, but you have not less to learn and maybe more from the people who, on the surface, according to the usual criteria, have not made it, have, wasted a lot of time or whatever. So I feel like this is a great kind of a point to close on. And of course, me and listeners already know your names and know where to find you, but I'd love to hear from you if there's anything new that you're working on or that you'd like to say, and also any parting words.
I have something I am working on, but it is top secret. So I will not tell you, and you just have to wonder about it and wait.
Ooh, amazing.
Way to build that hype, man. I'm stoked now. You got me excited. I'm like, oh wow, what is this? I need to know. I'm just like, okay, something, right? Like once you make it, like this is why I probably got into drugs, because like you banned it. Like if the moment, you're not allowed to do something as a child, you just want to do it just because you're not allowed to do it, right? Like, so the moment it's a secret, damn, now I have to find out what it's all about. But yeah, man, I mean, like, thank you so much for having us on. I mean, like, I really had a great time. Thank you, Brooke. It's such a incredible,
yeah.
It's the first time we're meeting.
Yeah.
And also the fact, like, this is so cool, right? I mean, there's so much we've been through, which is so similar, and like definitely scary experiences at the same time, experiences that made us who we are today, right? And about what Eyal was saying about, like, there are already systems in place where kids can go out, help the community, reach out to addicts. There are outreach programs. There are programs where you can go out and distribute clean needles. You can go there and help them with counseling. You can bring them in for treatment. There's a whole bunch of stuff. You can volunteer at halfway homes. There's a whole bunch of things happening. You can probably, I'm sure there are like programs where kids can go out on the streets, meet addicts, talk to them. Like if you're a filmmaker, like everyone has a camera phone, right? Like everyone can go up to the streets. You can do some sort of a documentary. There are always ways to go out, meet people, connect. Like you said, there are lessons to be learned out there. We are probably the ones who went there, and got the lessons out for ourselves by experiencing it, right? But like some wise person said, experience is what, like a comb you get when you're bald. Like it's probably useless when you've gone through that experience, right? But most people don't have to go through that. You can go there, look at what's happening on the streets, and maybe that'll help you understand a little bit about yourself, about the world, about the situation, about people, about the reality of what we think. I mean, like, it's so, like, who says something is a developed nation, something is not a developed nation? There's so much that we're told is the truth, that we're told is the reality of the world we live in. But I think a lot of that reality is only obvious when you walk the streets. Any city, any country, anywhere in the world, you walk the streets, that's when you get the reality of the place you live in.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you guys so much and have enjoyed it so much. Always love your insights and always looking forward to more conversations. So until next time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cheerio, my friend. See you, Brooke.